For our next interview, I spoke to the urbanist Richard Florida, who's a professor at the University of Toronto. He studied the development of cities for decades, and he spoke about this very issue. He said that after 9/11, the recession, both times he vastly underestimated how quickly cities would come roaring back, and that he's not going to make the same mistake this time. Here's our conversation. I wanted to speak to you in particular for this episode because you contributed to our roundup on foreignpolicy.com about how the pandemic may shape the future of cities, and you were pretty upbeat that cities will go on. What makes you so optimistic about this?
I'm actually more upbeat the longer time goes on, and it's sort of amazing to me that in the immediate wake of a crisis, in this case it's a global pandemic of an infectious disease, but the same thing happened with the economic and financial crisis of 2008, and the same thing happened in the wake of the terrorist attacks of 9/11. You get this incredible wave of short-term dystopian thinking, and it is always the same. Cities which have had this joyous ride because affluent people went back are going to take a turn for the worse. You're going to see boarded up storefronts. People are going to move to the suburbs. Cities are going to die. There's going to be the end of death of density. I mean, it's always the same story. And on the other hand, by the way, there's no shortage in this time around of utopian takes of people saying, we're going to wake up one day and our cities will be filled with bike lanes and pedestrianized streets and better parks and sidewalk cafes, and the cars will be gone. And neither of them are accurate. There's no doubt to me that New York and Washington, D.C., and Los Angeles and San Francisco and London and Paris will continue to be great cities. They will be magnificent cities. They're probably going to have a hard time in the next 6 to 9 to 12 months, but they will persevere. And in fact, what crises like this tend to do is accelerate changes already underway. They're not really big disruptions. They tend to accelerate changes already underway. And the way I'd put it is, in a 3-decade-plus career as an academic, I'd never once crossed my mind the role of pandemics or infectious disease in shaping the trajectory of urbanization. That's because urbanization has always been a greater force, the force that pushes us together in denser agglomerations, that we work better, we're more productive, more innovative, has always overcome pandemics, far worse than this one. The 1918 pandemic, New York City grew by 2 million people between 1910 and 1930. You go back to the cholera epidemics in London, the Great Plagues in Europe, which might have killed 40 to 50% of urban populations. They really never dented the trajectory of cities. And in fact, what has tended to happen, which sounds so bizarre, is that young people and highly ambitious people and immigrants tend to move towards cities in the wake of pandemics, largely because of the opportunities they offer. So yeah, cities are going to have a hard run, fiscally, economically, going to be transport-wise, over the next 6 to 9 to 12 months, but they'll be fine in the long run.
This is the first devastating global pandemic that we've seen in the digital age, where white-collar jobs in particular are less and less tied to specific locations. Could that change the equation at all?
Well, I think we're lucky, and I think that's one of the reasons we've been able to mitigate the effects of this pandemic, because, that's going to mitigate the spread. And yeah, not just that, we have better medical technology, we have better hospital systems. I mean, this is the first real pandemic that's hit the advanced world when it is in this kind of situation. I think with regard to remote work, I think that's going to be I think there are a couple trends that will be lasting. Remote work will be one. They say 40% of us can remote work. It won't be 40% of us, maybe 20. It's up, maybe 20% of us will decide we like it. I think online education will also stick. Maybe not completely online education, but my kids, I have a 3 and a 4-year-old. I can tell you my main disciplinary technique right now is you have to go to real school. They don't know any different. They're like, no, I'll be good if you let me go to Zoom school. And I think bike lanes. I think, this sounds so trite, but I think the other big thing we'll see in cities, which we often do, streets get widened, parks get made better. We put public drinking. So I think bike lanes. I mean, those are the kinds of things that will endure. But I think with regard to remote work, I like to think about the factors that act on cities in two separate set of forces. There are pull factors. Pull factors are like remote work, fear of transit. And I think there's one cohort in particular that's likely to leave cities and that has left cities, maybe two. One is older and more vulnerable people. But I think the main one is people in the family formation years. I think it's everyone I know who's left a big city, and particularly Manhattan, has had the same profile. They're a youngish couple, or maybe not so youngish couple. They have one or two or three kids. Those kids are all like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, maybe 6. Or they're newly with child or trying to have children. So they're in that family formation stage. And I think what's happening is those folks have just said, I can't deal with it for a whole expense, space, no place to work remotely. I'm scared of transit. I want to drive a car. I want a yard. I want a swing set. So I think what the pandemic has done is accelerated moves that would have occurred over, say, 1 to 2 to 3 to 5 years. Because people would have postponed this. I'll stay in Chelsea for a few years. I'll stay in DuPont Circle for a few more years. I'll stay in downtown San Francisco. And then they go, no, screw it. But on the other hand, I think there are push factors. And the push factors, I think, are that really important industries like high-tech, finance, media, and entertainment are not going to decentralize. Maybe some of their workers will decentralize, particularly mid-career workers. They're going to stay in New York, San Francisco, Washington, D.C., Los Angeles, the list goes on. And I think young people are going to flock to cities. I think that young people who are risk oblivious anyway are just going to go find opportunities in cities. Other young people are in cities. There's a better mating market in cities. And so I think that what you're likely to see in the short term is cities to get younger. And I think if cities play their cards right, because of the residential real estate prices won't increase as much, there'll be a glut of offices that nobody knows what to do with. Although I think young people who are in a cramped apartment are going to want to work in an office pretty quickly. So I don't think it's going to be as bad as everyone says. And there'll be some retail, there's some retail stuff that's going to be crunched. I think that cities have a little opportunity of a few years to reset themselves so they can be more attractive to working people, to young people, and to artistic and musical creatives who've been pushed out.
You mentioned earlier that there's been some utopian thinking as to how this could shape cities, that the cities of the future after this are going to be full of bike lanes and large parks and everything is going to be lovely. But we didn't exactly need a pandemic to tell us that cities were woefully unequal places and that your zip code can in many ways predict your life expectancy. So do you think we're actually going to learn anything from the experience of this pandemic? Do you share this utopian thinking?
Unfortunately, no. I mean, I would invoke my Karl Marx and say a crisis lays bare the contradictions of capitalism and makes everyone aware of, the horribly satanic mills and all of that. I read my Marx through and through, but the honest history is, if you read the history of the 1918 pandemic, that alone, people call it the forgotten pandemic. That's what it's called. And that's the actual name of the pandemic, the forgotten pandemic. And personally, I didn't know this until now because I looked up pandemics. I was born in 1957. My mom was pregnant with me in the middle of a pandemic. And that was a pandemic that hit infants and children as well as others. They never mentioned it. Moreover, my parents were born both in the 20s, but they're amongst the youngest of their respective very large families of 7. Which means nearly all of my aunts and uncles were either born during the Spanish flu or kids during the Spanish flu. Nobody told me. I'd heard the term Spanish flu, but in my own family. So, when people talk about the forgotten pandemic, they say none of the great writers, Hemingway, Faulkner, and all the rest, they talked about the war. They talked about economic crises. So there's something in our psyches. And then, of course, what followed the 1918 pandemic, for better or worse, is the Roaring '20s. There's something in our psyches that doesn't allow us to adequately process these things. In the way that we remember wars and great economic crises, we tend to forget. So my biggest hope is that we don't forget. If you ask me what my biggest hope is, not that we think in a utopian way, but that we simply remember, because my fear is that this is the warning pandemic. And in a way, as horrifically, 100,000 Americans dead is just a horrifying number. But the reality is this could be a much worse disease. It could be much more lethal. It's plenty contagious, but it could be much more lethal. And it instead of taking our elders mainly and disproportionately minorities, it could target children. The way, as a father of young kids, that would I couldn't sleep. So maybe the only, I don't want to call it silver lining, the only thing we could look to is that this prepares us. I just think we need to take this stuff really seriously and build cities and community suburbs that are much more effective at being able to be equipped to battle these things, because I don't think this is no one in their right mind would think, but I don't think anyone thinks this is the last one. They may actually be accelerating with climate change and all the other globalization and all the other things that are happening.
That was Professor Richard Florida of the University of Toronto. That's it for this week. We'll be back next Monday. And don't forget to subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. In the meantime, head over to foreignpolicy.com for all the latest news and analysis on how the coronavirus is shaping the world as we know it. And if you have pandemic fatigue, and let's face it, no one would blame you, we've got plenty of coverage of all the other things that are happening in the world as well. I'm Amy McKinnon.
And I'm James Palmer.
Our show is produced by me and Darcy Palder and is edited by Rob Sachs. Our web team includes Laurie Kelly and Kelly Kimball. The executive producer for news and podcasts at Foreign Policy is Dan Efron. Until next time, please remember to wash your hands.
And don't touch your face.